What do the great mystics of Carmel have to say about the divine will? We will compare that to the writings of Luisa Piccarreta, and also we'll provide some quotations from these great saints of Carmel. This diagram that we see is a relationship found in the writings between those saints of Carmel and the writings of Luisa Piccarreta concerning the divine will. In the middle, we have commonality between the two. There are some differences, and we'll discuss those differences as we go through this. First, I'd like to talk about the commonality. There's a great emphasis in the writings of Carmel concerning the divine love and divine will, and its relationship to spiritual growth, and also how it's an end that we're seeking in our union with God. When I first started reading the writings of Luisa Piccarreta, I was struck by this commonality that often sounds like it's verbatim from some of these doctors of the church from Carmel, in particular the faculties of the soul. The faculties of the soul are described in the Book of Heaven by Luisa Piccarreta, or Jesus to Luisa Piccarreta, as the memory, the will, and the intellect, which is exactly how St. John of the Cross describes it. Also, the disposition of the soul, a great deal of the writing of us, in particular St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, they concern the preparation of the soul and the advancement of the soul in spiritual growth, and has to do with the disposition of it, the elimination of inordinate attachments, as an example. And in the Book of Heaven, Jesus also talks about the disposition of the soul and how the disposition can prevent souls from entering into the highest degree within the divine will, which is the fourth degree. And he says, many will just do these acts of divine will in my light, but few will enter into the fourth degree, and it is because of that disposition. And those who are familiar with the divine will and trying to live in it can gain a lot of benefit by understanding the writings of these saints of Carmel regarding preparation of the soul and its disposition. Also, obviously, a great commonality is the degrees versus the mansions as described by St. Teresa of Avila, where she describes 7 mansions, and our Lord describes 4 degrees in the divine will. Let's take a look at on the left, the Carmel side and the divine will, where we have some differences, and I'd like to go through some quotations to talk about those a little. What I found in the writings is that there is a tendency to have a submissive attitude regarding the divine will. In other words, a resignation of one's human will to the divine will. And in the divine will, the writings are different. And the reason being is that the gift of the divine will was not available when these writings were created by St. Therese or St. Teresa of Avila or St. John of the Cross. And the gift of divine will also entails a type of an ownership of the will, where it is your will and a will you're sharing with God when you're in the fourth degree. So let's take a look at some of the quotations surrounding this, and this one is from St. Teresa of Avila, and I'll read that. For true union can quite well be achieved with the favor of our Lord if we endeavor to attain it by not following our own will, but submitting it to whatever is the will of God. Again, it's that submission. Next one is, we cannot attain to the heights I have spoken of if we are not sure that we have the union in which we resign our wills to the will of God. Again, a form of submission. And next, conformity. For it is very important is to labor and be resolute and prepare himself with all possible diligence to bring his will into conformity with the will of God. And these quotes are all from St. Teresa of Avila, Interior Castle. Next, we have a few quotes from the Book of Heaven, from Luisa Piccarreta. My daughter, having placed in you the ownership of my will, I want you not only to possess it, but to be able to keep it, cultivate it, expand it, so as to multiply it. Again, it's the ownership that I mentioned. And next is, you must know that in the fulfilled acts of my will enters the inseparability of everything it has done and will do. And that's the great power of the omnipresence that our Lord shares with us in the fourth degree of the divine will, where our Lord, of course, is eternal, and his presence exists in the past, present, and future. And Padre Pio explained this one time to one of his spiritual children by saying, don't you know that our Lord knows I can pray in the future for something to happen in the past? I don't need to pray, in other words, at this very moment. Our Lord knows that I will do this prayer in the future, and he will provide the benefits of that prayer to the present or even to the past, because our Lord is eternal and lives in the past, present, and the future. It is all one for our Lord. And that is what's being described here. That I did not see, and that's a difference in the writings in Carmel. I like to mention that the commonality that exists between the writings of Carmel about the divine will and the Book of Heaven's writings by Luisa Piccarreta leads me to believe that Carmel is an excellent springboard for the divine will. If you understand the writings of Carmel, you'll have a great boost in going through the degrees of the divine will. Another thing I'd like to add is that, coincidentally, there's a couple of orders that have been started concerning the divine will, and they are both been started by the Benedictines. The Benedictine daughters of the divine will and the Benedictine monks of the divine will. And the monks are led by a priest, Father Elijah, and it's interesting he picked that name being a Benedictine. It's a very Carmelite name, and also he professes to love the writings of Carmel, of St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. So it's just more confirmation that there's this tie-in with these writings, and that indeed these writings of Carmel and the teachings are an excellent springboard, as I mentioned, into the divine will, and they coincide and complement each other very well. What I would like to do is show some quotations. These are beautiful quotations about the divine will from St. Therese, St. Teresa of Avila, and St. John of the Cross. I'd like to go through those quickly. These are put into meme form, so they could be copied out and posted as a picture if you would like to do that. The first is from St. Therese, and all of these from St. Therese are from the Story of a Soul. Holiness consists simply in doing God's will. Very simply stated, very sublime. Accept the offering of my will, for I choose all that thou willest. Again from St. Therese, nothing here can satisfy, and we can find rest only in holding ourselves ready to do God's will. And the more gladly they do his will, the greater is their perfection. Beautiful testimony. And this is very insightful and very, very sublime regarding the union that exists in this will. To be resigned and to be united to the will of God are not the same. So she's making a distinction between being united and resignation. And you can see why she's a doctor of the church here. There is the same difference between them as that which exists between union and unity. In union, there are still two. In unity, there is but one. And again, that describes in the divine will the unity of the act. In other words, performing the act in God, and that act sharing the divinity of God and the omnipresence. And it's not that the person performing the act is divine. That thinking is very erroneous. It's that the act being performed is divine through participation with God. And as Jesus tells Luisa Piccarreta, he says that you perform through grace what I do through nature. So it is a sharing of the will. And now St. Therese, but you must not doubt the possibility of this true union with the will of God. This is the union which I have desired all my life. It is for this that I continually beseech our Lord. It is this which is the most genuine and the safest. And now for this great mystic of Carmel, St. John of the Cross. The state of this divine union consists in the soul's total transformation according to the will, in the will of God, so that there may be naught in the soul that is contrary to the will of God, but that in all and through all, its movement may be that of the will of God alone. And again, we say of this state, that is the making of two wills into one, namely into the will of God, which will of God is likewise the will of the soul. For if this soul desired any imperfection that God wills not, there would not be made one will of God. And that's also something that's almost a paraphrase of what Jesus tells to Luisa Piccarreta in her writings. When all that is unlike God and unconformed to him is cast out, the soul may receive the likeness of God, and nothing will then remain in it that is not the will of God, and it will thus be transformed in God. So you can see the relationship between these writings regarding the will of God and the divine will writings of Luisa Piccarreta, there are differences, as I mentioned, but you can see that there is a great deal of overlap and conformity regarding these writings versus the writings you get and see in the Book of Heaven. And this is probably the most interesting and the most right on point quotation. And this comes from the Living Flame of Love. Most the other writings that I just went over, those quotations, they were from the Ascent of Mount Carmel. But let's take a look at these. I'll read these. The soul has become God through participation in God, being united to and absorbed in him as it is in this state. God's will and the soul's are one through their own free consent. Then the soul has attained possession of God insofar as this is possible by way of the will and grace. Again, just like I quoted previously, what we can do in a fourth degree by grace, God does by nature. It is almost as if St. John of the Cross was given, and he must have been given, a foresight into this gift that would be provided through Luisa Piccarreta. Obviously, his union with God was so great that his intellect, the faculty of the intellect of the soul, was united with God to such a degree where he was given an open window into this gift, even though it may not have been provided back when he was alive. Being the shadow of God through the substantial transformation, it performs in this measure in God and through God what we through himself does in it. And for the will of the two is one will, and thus God's operation and the soul's are one. I hope you enjoyed these beautiful testimonies to the divine will by the great saints and mystics and doctors of the church from Carmel. And if you would like to see some other videos on the Elijah's Cloak channel, I'd like to recommend the 4 degrees of the divine will, if you'd like more insight into that. Also, 4th degree of the divine will that is basically focused and emphasizes that degree and gives it some more time. The 4 degrees of divine will is a rather long one, and it's roughly 50 some minutes. And I decided after that to do another one on just the 4th degree. So the 4 degrees of the divine will is an excellent way of understanding what the degrees are, where you are in the divine will, and how to advance. And I would recommend that if you have not received an introduction, there's a couple quick introductions to the divine will also on this channel. Again, I'd like you to subscribe and to like the video, and that helps us spread the message and the gift of the divine will. Thank you for joining.